As a former England rugby player, people often ask what it is actually like to play for your country. So I thought I'd do this video to give you all the details and the behind the scenes. I played rugby in the era where it was amateur, it then went semi-pro, and then it went professional. So I've really got experience across the board. My first cap was 20 years ago. Awful, horrendous to think about, and I can't believe it has been that long. So I got my first cap back in 2005, and it's safe to say that women's rugby was in a very, very different place to how it is now. I feel very privileged to be such a part of rugby's journey, and now even getting to commentate on it. So I'm going to chat through exactly how it was and share some experiences with you and how far the game has come too. So there are obviously some really big differences. I'm going to take you through the main three. First up, no-brainer, it's the money. When I started playing for England, there weren't professional contracts. It was not a career. We knew that. You don't get paid for it. I've been paid a lot more money doing commentary than I ever did as a player. In fact, my very first England camp that I went to before I was capped, young, keen, and I actually had to write a £25 check to attend England training. But of course you did it. You wanted to go and play for England. I was born in the Midlands, so it was a lot of travel as most England camps were London based. And I remember being super excited that once I got into the 44, the elite squad, we got paid expenses on our mileage. So those expenses were 10p a mile, excluding the first 100 miles. So didn't really get much, but thought it was really cool. We also had to pay subs for our club, and that was completely normal. So we paid to play rugby at our clubs, even when we were playing for England. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the current professional contracts aren't exactly huge salaries. However, it is a career. The women at the minute don't have to have a second job. They can just focus on being rugby players, which is really, really cool. And I love now that young girls can watch the Red Roses absolutely smash it and know there is a career in the future of an option for them to go and play professional rugby. The next big thing that's changed is the kit. So the nice streamlined shirts that they have now definitely weren't around when I first started playing, and getting hold of an England shirt and being able to keep it, they were like gold dust. If you were really, really lucky, you might get one shirt a season. And that was only if they were updating the shirts. I was really lucky. I managed to get my first starting cap shirt, and I've kept that one as well as my World Cup winning shirt to this day. When I was a little bit more experienced and had a few caps under my belt, there was a young winger and they were handing out the shirts and she was going to get the subs one, and I was like, no, absolutely not, have the 14, because I think that your first shirt you ever get should be the number that you want to play. Also the type of kit. So quite often at club we ended up having the hand-me-downs of like the men's third team kit, which was obviously way too baggy for us. I got loads of really funny photos. I'm so skinny. I wore a scrum cap at under 16s and I've got these big baggy shirts that are hanging off me. And then to think just 10 years later, they were developing 7 shirts that had bright yellow stripes on them to help us on our peripheral vision to spot our supporting teammates. And don't even get me started on GPS. We had to wear these extra sports bras where you'd put the GPS in the back, and they were just coming in when they were optional. So you could opt into wearing them or you didn't have to. And I actually chose not to wear them because I just didn't like anything distracting me. But now they are totally the norm. And again, it was quite cool after playing a game that you could track your stats and see the distance covered. I remember playing England France, and it was a game where just didn't touch it. The ball did not get wide. And then actually the amount of meters that I covered and the amount of sprints that I did was really massive. Whereas I would never have guessed that, but it was just still did all the same running, just didn't get the ball. So stats were sometimes pretty interesting. And you wanted to always make sure that you hit top speed. Now I think the girls get the England shirts a lot more frequently, which is really great. And you even see them after games swapping them with other nations, which I remember being asked to do when I was quite new, and I was like, no, I'm not. I never get an England shirt. I'm definitely not going to swap it for another nation's. Whereas actually getting other team shirts would have been really, really cool if you had enough England shirts. And then the third major thing that's changed is the crowd sizes. We used to play, despite playing in the Premiership, we played at some grounds that were really, really grotty. We played on third team pitches that were pretty much swamps. We played on frozen pitches. There was a particular ground where you had to go through to get to the changing rooms, these like horrid things that you get in like the butchers to like go through, so it was awful. So we'd have to go through those. Then there was other clubs as well where the showers were either like scalding hot, where you had to just stand and try and splash yourself because the showers were that hot, or the opposite, they were freezing cold. And because I played for Worcester, most of the time it was a good 3-hour coach journey to any of the clubs that we played. We also used to play on Sundays, which is never as good as being able to play on a Saturday and then having Sunday to recover. Even internationals, we weren't playing them at proper stadiums, and the crowd sizes really reflected that. At club, it was pretty much one man and his dog, probably my dad, and internationally, you'd be getting a couple of thousand. I remember being so close to some of my friends coming to watch on the wing. I remember waving at them and then thinking probably shouldn't be doing that in an international, but the setup for it was just made like that. In some cases, people stood behind a barrier which is 5 meters away from the pitch. Now in 2010, we had a home World Cup final at the Stoop, and we had at least 10,000 people there, which at that time for a standalone women's game was huge. But when you compare it to last year's England's game versus France in the Six Nations at Twickenham, they got 58,000 people there. I was doing the commentary for 5 Live and I got goosebumps. It was such an incredible moment of how far the sport has come. And the game was incredible as well, so a really amazing advert for the game. But now in all the different countries across this Six Nations alone, there's been record crowds in each of the countries, and the support for it has just grown and grown. An example of this is when I was playing, it would be quite often people would go, oh, do women play rugby? Whereas now you mention rugby and people are like, oh yeah, that Ellie Kildunn's really fast, or they're naming those players, or they'll say, oh, I'd pick her at 10, or there's those conversations where people are actually watching the rugby and know the players, and I love that. I think it's absolutely awesome. And of course, not just the crowd sizes, but also the platforms that it's on. The Premiership being streamed and on TNT now, and the coverage of the England games as well on TV is fantastic. Now, despite how much the game has changed, I've always felt like we were professionals. We were just professionals that had 2 jobs. We'd play an England game on a Sunday and we'd go back to work on a Monday. One of our players was actually a doctor and she came off a night shift to come and play for England. Can you imagine that? Just no sleep, straight in, playing international rugby for her country. But it did breed a certain type of player. You had to be a player that was willing to get up at 6 a.m. and train, to then go to work all day and then go to rugby training in the evening. We were tough. I genuinely believe our era and the eras before were tough because we had to be, because it was before professionalism. I was then part of the first wave of the Sevens contracts and we were semi-professional. Now, whilst this was exciting, it was without a doubt the hardest period of my life. It's a great idea in theory, but I found it really, really difficult to go and train 3 days in a week. I think we did Sunday to Tuesday, something like that. Then we would come out of camp and you'd go to your club, and then you'd have a normal life where you go and work and fit in whatever you could do around that, because it was very difficult to actually have a career when you're semi-pro in something. Plus you had the driving back and forth, and mentally and physically I was totally fatigued. Now that's not to say I wouldn't do it all over again in a heartbeat, and it was a really cool opportunity and a huge step towards getting the contracts to where they are now. But I'm not gonna lie, it was incredibly tough, and there were definitely times where I was really, really knackered and did question my choices. And even in the semi-professional era, because England went quite early with this and other nations had to catch up. But even in this era, I remember going to a tournament and we had a coach who had predominantly coached men's high-level sevens, and he'd come across to us. And after a tournament, you all eat together and you just get served what's there, and that's what you have. It was a European tournament and we got brought out our food, and it was chicken and some rice. As we were cutting into our chicken, we realised it was pretty raw, close to the bone. So we were like, oh, we can't really eat this. We'll just pick around the edges, which feels ridiculous to say, but we weren't used to getting handouts and you just had to put up with what you were given. And I remember him standing up, and this is all the other teams were there as well, and he stood up and was like, we're not doing this, we're out of here. And he took us all out, and I think he bought us all like Subways or something like that. He was like, you need to eat properly, you need to recover, you're playing again tomorrow, come on, and just took us out. And that level of his professionalism for what we needed, I think was a really good drive for us to go, oh, okay, yeah, we are worth having good food and we do need that for our own performance. But that said, aside from it being really hard, I have some incredible memories of that time, and the amount of bonding that you did with your teammates, because it wasn't perfect, because we had terrible conditions. And honestly, some of the worst tournaments were some of the best, because you really do bond over those moments and you have to dig deep and see what you've got. In fact, one tournament, I remember having to sew our own badges onto our shirts for an international tournament, but we laugh about that now and it's a memory that is going to sit with us forever. And normally it sounds really glamorous because you get to travel the world and go to amazing places, places, but a lot of the time you're mainly just seeing the pitch and the hotel. And the hotels at that time, because the budget wasn't particularly good, weren't all that great either. So we've been in some pretty hot and sweaty gross places. And we normally flew in the day before, so we were always pretty jet lagged as well. But honestly, some of the funniest times of my life. And that downtime in camps when you just get to hang out with your teammates is the biggest thing I miss about playing rugby. Yes, obviously the rugby itself is really fun, but those moments together as a team were my favourite part. Now, before the World Cup in 2014, we went fully professional. It was a short-term contract that ended the day after the World Cup final. But unlike being semi-pro, being fully professional, even for that short period, was great because you had one focus. We didn't have to train before work because training was at work. But also, in a slightly controversial take here, whilst I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to do it, there are some really boring times. You can be on camp for a couple of weeks, and it's not like in the downtime you can go off and do fun things and have your own space. You are with your teammates all the time, which is great, and I do love being sociable, but having some time to switch off, also super, super important. We also in downtime do things like foam rolling, ice baths, pool recovery, and a lot of video analysis. Now, some players are really, really into video analysis. Me and a couple of the other wingers, not so much our forte, but it has a hugely important role and I can really understand why teams do it. So I preferred being pro to being semi-pro by a long way, but actually the amateur days weren't that bad because I look back on it with such fond memories. And I think part of achieving something is having done it and gone through hard times. Now, all that said, I would love to have had the opportunity to go fully professional at club level because those wouldn't be the long camps that can drag out. That would be the day in, you go home, you do your training, you hang out with your mates, and that part of it I would absolutely love. And the key thing would be the recovery because that was the toughest part, not having time to recover. Now, I retired early. I retired at 28 through too many concussions. So my body, despite having a fair few injuries along the way, recovery wasn't too much of an issue, but I feel like it would have been the more those professional contracts come in without having the appropriate recovery time, which they now absolutely do. I was also part of the first fully pro contracts for the Sevens, signed it was all announced, but then sadly never got to take up that opportunity because of the concussions. So that's my perspective of my experience having played amateur, semi-pro and pro, but I know now that it's in a very different place, and I love that the women now are fully contracted, and I love that young girls can look up and have that career. Now I want to go into a little bit more detail about what being in an England camp is actually like. So for the majority of my career, I was traveling down from Worcester. So the camps would generally be in London, so you'd have a 2-3 hour drive, you'd head down there nice and early to beat traffic, and then you'd all arrive and meet at around 9 a.m. You then might have breakfast as a squad, and then you'd go into team meetings. There were a lot of team meetings. So depending what camp was for, sometimes you'd just have training camps, but other times you'd go into camp ahead of a game. That would determine the focus of the meeting. But you'd pretty much get an understanding of what the week's layout was going to look like, and Jamman, our amazing manager, would give us little handouts of the schedule for the week. In the schedule as well, you were told what kit to wear, to which sessions, and all the timings that were in there. So on day one, after breakfast, after a meeting, we'd head out and we'd do our first session of the day. This might be a skill session, might be a weight session, might be a short speed session or short weight session into a pitch session, but you'd get your morning training done, then you'd come in, you'd have your lunch as a team, you might even have another meeting, maybe forwards and backs. You'd have about 45 minutes to let your food go down, and then you'd be back out onto the training pitch. So second session of the day, straight after lunch. This one was always a little slog to get into, but generally was more game based, or we'd do some carousels to keep it nice and interesting. After the second session, you would go and you would do pool recovery, potentially ice baths. Then you would all run to the physio list or the massage list to sign up for any treatments that you might need. You'd fight for the slots that were closer to dinner. And after pool recovery, you'd head back, you'd shower, you'd have about half an hour to get ready before you head back down to dinner. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, always a buffet style, and generally filled with pretty healthy stuff. And that is part of the thing of being on camp. Sometimes you can get that food fatigue, especially when it's buffet style food. After dinner, probably another meeting, maybe it's analysis, maybe it's a full team meeting, but it's usually another meeting in there. Then you have your downtime, so you'd go and chill in your little groups. There's a group of us that used to play cards. Other groups, they call them the granny group, would go to bed early, or you'd have the cool kids hanging out. So we'd mainly just hang out in our little groups and then go to bed relatively early, so we're ready to go again in the morning. Generally, it was a pretty early wake up, so we'd go and we'd do our recovery session. So this would be a mix of foam rolling. Some people would do upper body and shoulder prehab, others would do knees, just completely depended on previous injury status, things like that. And if you weren't injured, then they'd probably look at core or things like that. One of the things they introduced towards the end of my career was they do a short power session about an hour before you then go and do your session, all to do with that second wind and getting you ready for playing. After this, you'd go have breakfast, have a bit of a break, you'd head out and you'd do your sessions. So generally we'd look at 2 sessions a day as well as around 2, maybe 3 meetings. And then we'd always have an afternoon or an evening off within a camp to maybe go and do a team activity or a quiz or something fun that's not too active. So we did have to have off-feet recovery time. They did once let us go and do laser quest and they absolutely regretted it. Marley Packer rolled her ankle, it was chaos. So we had to be very controlled and calm in our downtime after that. So in camp as well, you might have one-on-one meetings with your coach and you might have mini unit meetings. We also had player reps. So these were players that were elected and they were rotated at times as well to make sure that messages between the coaches and the staff and the players, that everything was all good. Now the other big drama in camp was sorting out washing. We didn't have a load of kit. So if you were told you had to wear your rugby kit for rugby session 1 on day 1, but then you also had to wear it in the afternoon session of day 2. You obviously didn't want to wear a smelly shirt, so you'd end up washing it in the sink and trying to hair dry it dry and things. So the laundry side of things was always a bit more complicated. The more kit you had, the better it was because you could get it sent off and to get washed and dried. But when it was a short turnaround, it was never good, especially the slinky material tops. So we just used to accept that we'd all smell when we had to wear those, which was pretty gross. So hopefully that gives you an insight into camp. It's a lot of food, it's a lot of protein shakes, a lot of training, a lot of meetings, and a lot of recovery and prehab. But if you do have any questions about anything, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'm finally going to talk about where does the women's game go now. So there are definitely 3 nations, England, France, and New Zealand, that are super competitive. Arguably England being above everyone else, but New Zealand always sign up for World Cups. So other nations are investing and they're giving contracts to their nations, but these things take time. Wales, for example, have had contracts for 3 years now, but aren't really seeing the benefits of them. Scotland, on the other hand, I feel you can see the impact of those contracts which have just come in. So we need the other nations to step up, but I love the introduction of WXB. So it allows other teams to play rugby more often. Having competitive matches is only going to help raise the standard. Next year, we obviously have World Cup, which is going to be huge. It's a home World Cup for England. There's talk about trying to fill Twickenham, and after the disappointment of losing out in New Zealand, and before that losing to New Zealand in Ireland, England really are after this one. And I feel there is quite a lot of pressure on them because they have crazy winning streaks. They win 32 games in a row, and then the one they lose is the World Cup final. So there is definitely going to be some high pressure training for them to get them in the best possible place to win the World Cup. But at the minute, with coverage getting better, with crowd sizes getting better, having more competitive games, women's rugby is in a really good place. We just need a couple of other nations to close that gap between England, France, and New Zealand. And then I think we have a really competitive product. If this has been an interesting topic, then feel free to drop some questions into the comments, which I can cover next time. Happy to do a bit of a mini series on it if it is something of interest. Make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.